to this day, you know, one of the most important people in terms of our own story is Rod Smallwood, the manager of Iron Maiden, because he was someone that believed in us early. I think something in the way we were approaching the subject of metal, he understood we were coming from a place of respect. Also, ideally wanting to do something that was going to be big and make an impact. So Rod was really instrumental. Like, he connected us with a whole range of other artists. It kind of went from this kind of a snowball effect. Like, once you get Maiden and Slayer and a few others, it just gets easier and easier, right? Because you can tell people, well, hey, we got these folks, and it kind of goes from there. So it was messy. We didn't know what we were doing, but, you know, good thing we didn't have any kids and nothing else to do. So we could take 5 years to do it.
Hey, what's up, Vox and Hops heads? I'm Matt, the vocalist of Cryptopsy and the host of the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast, brought to you by Sound Talent Media, where I sit down with fellow metal musicians to talk about their lives, music, and craft beer. I hope you had a glorious weekend. I most certainly did. This Vox and Hops episode is presented by Heavy Montreal. Heavy Montreal are Montreal's premier metal promoter. They put on a bunch of amazing shows throughout the year here in Montreal, but more than that, they also put on one of North America's sickest festivals, and that's the absolute truth. I have played festivals all across the globe, and Heavy Montreal are up there with the best of them. I am beyond stoked to have Heavy Montreal behind the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast. Super stoked to announce that I have teamed up with Indie Merch Store to bring you the official Vox and Hops Metal Podcast merchandise. You can go to my website, voxandhops.com/merch. That's voxandhops.com/merch to check out all of the amazing merchandise that is available there. You can also use the promo code VOXHOPS10, that's VOXHOPS10, at checkout, and you will save 10% off of your entire purchase. Before we jump into today's episode, I would just like to ask you to follow the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast on the podcast platform of your choice. But more than that, I'm also asking you to tell a friend about the podcast. If there is someone in your life that enjoys metal and craft beer, let them know about the podcast. You can tell them that there are over 280 episodes available on their favorite podcast platform for them to go back and listen to with some of the world's best metal artists and brewers. If you were to encourage someone to become a future Vox and Hops head, I would be extremely grateful. Now, on today's episode, I'm with Sam Dunn of Banger Films. Get ready, everyone. This is Vox and Hops episode number 285.
I warn you, what you are about to hear is very disturbing indeed.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Today I'm with Sam Dunn of Banger. I am so excited to be with you. I have wanted to be with you since I started the podcast. One of those bucket list guests. I am very, very excited that we are having this conversation today. Sam, how are you doing?
I'm great, Matt. Yeah, it's nice to be here. I've known about your podcast for a long time and hundreds of episodes. So yeah, just happy to sit down and talk with you. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely. Let's just dive straight into the darkness before we can have some fun. How did you cope with the glorious year that is now far behind us, but is still lingering on, of 2020?
You know, I guess it's a cliche. It was tough, but there's lots of silver linings. I have 2 young kids and a wife, and we've spent a lot of time together. You know, kids struggled parts with the whole online thing, blah, blah, blah. But overall, you know, I think I'll look back at this time principally as a time when I probably spent the most time with my family, maybe in my whole life. So I think what seemed very stressful in the short term, I think in the long term is actually good. We're going to look back on it with some fondness in a weird way, but that's of course saying that from the perspective of someone who's very lucky, who hasn't been affected by COVID in any direct way, nor any family members. So thankful for that.
It is nice to have a moment of rest that is imposed upon us. Being artists, musicians, you know, we're always on tour. You have been busy since forever doing, you know, many movies: ZZ Top, Iron Maiden, Rush, Satan Lives, Tragically Hip, Alice Cooper, Metal Evolution, Global Metal, Headbanger's Journey. You got TV shows going on. You got shows for kids with the B minor. So it just never stops. It never stops for you. So at least the pandemic almost forced you to stop.
Well, you know, no. I don't know if I'm capable of stopping. I mean, spent a lot of time with the family, as I said, but for us at Banger, for Scott and I, we kind of barreled down and focused on developing new projects. We were lucky, like when the pandemic hit, we were actually in post-production on 2 series and 1 feature-length film, which meant that timing wise, like it could have affected us a lot more strongly. If we had been in the middle of filming stuff, it would have been a different story. So we kind of lucked out in terms of timing, but really beyond that, taking the time to just doing a lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of Zoom calls with networks, like just doing the hustle, and it's been hard because I think a lot of the networks similarly have it's been a moment for them to pause and think about priorities. So, we didn't get as many green lights as we would have liked over the last year and a half, but we feel like things are relaxing now. So hopefully we'll make up for that time.
Amazing. So exciting to hear that new things are coming. You are someone that just never stopped. Very inspiring as you've created this empire. I love it. Let's talk about what Vox and Hops is all about. Vox and Hops is all about hanging out with my metal friends, talking about their lives, music, and craft beer. Now, what beer do you have on your side today that we're going to be sharing virtually?
Well, here at Banger in Toronto, we're in the same building as Henderson's Brewery. We're there on the ground floor. We're on the 3rd floor. So very good beer is literally steps away. And so I'm drinking their sort of original ale, which is called Henderson's Best, which has been part of their fleet, if you will, since I think pretty much since day one. So yeah, I've always liked this beer. We'll get into this, but I'm a fan of the kind of malty English style beers, that end of the spectrum. And as far as Canadian versions of that, this does a pretty good job. So.
It's true. Henderson rules. Mad shout out to Jamie Morris, one of their brewers. I've had him on the podcast. He's been a true friend. Henderson actually brewed a Vox and Hops beer. They brewed 2 of them. They brewed Devastation, which was a black lager, when I was going to be hosting a after party there for Devastation on the Nation, but sadly that never came to. But the beer did exist and it was delicious. And just recently they released a brew as a part of Brewtal North America with Chris Thrashed. Chris Soutsos, he's a great kid. Love him, full of energy. Love that guy. And they do make more like British style brews, and they don't really mess around with the hype of the craze of the IPAs and all the madness that is going on.
Yeah, well, I'm doing this partly because I've got a lot of opinions about beer, whether people will agree or not. But I look forward to that. But I get the good fortune of, I walk 10 minutes from my house to our office, and quite often I'll come around the corner and the doors of Henderson will be open and metal will be blasting out of the brewery, courtesy mostly of Jamie. And so it always feels like a good welcome.
It's amazing. It's amazing. On my side, I am drinking a Brewtal North America collab. This is from Cannery Brewing and Unleash the Archers. It's their North Wheat Pilsner, taken from the Northwest Passage song that they had released a few years back that had some success for them. Killer Brew. I'm going to crack this, and I want to hear about your very first beer, Sam.
Oh, man. Don't know if it's my first, but the one I remember most was probably a very warm and not so tasty Extra Old Stock. You remember Extra Old Stock? I'm dating myself here. I do. I'm in my late 40s, so my references can go back a ways. But it was, my dad drank it. It was just sort of like the everyman's beer. I think it was cheap. That's primarily maybe the criteria there. But that's my memory of the first taste of it. And I hate to say it's not a fond one, but I'm glad that beer has come a long way since Extra Old Stock.
Yes, cheers.
Cheers to that.
Ooh, it smells amazing. It's got that wheat, but it's like lemony citrus. Delicious, super smooth. I think it's 4.5%, 5.5% ABV. Yeah. Killer, amazing, love it. How about your craft beer evolution? At what point did you realize that beer could be more than that stock?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Victoria, BC, and I don't know the dates. I'm not that level of an expert, but the micro brew, as it was called, kind of movement started pretty early in BC. So you had small brews coming in from like the interior, or even, Vancouver Island had some early beers as well, beyond the Kokanees and beyond the Molsons and that kind of Okanagan Springs comes to mind. Like that's when I feel it's probably in around, the early 90s around there, where you started to get a sense that beer was becoming this kind of cottage thing. And so I think that it was right around there, of course, I turned 19 in 1993, so that probably had something to do with it. So maybe I got lucky in terms of timing, like right when around the age I was of age, that kind of those early days of the microbrew industry, at least in BC, was kicking off.
Which correlates sort of to you being a young teenager and the metal movement kicking off at the same time too.
Yeah, I guess they all go hand in hand. I mean, I remember, before I was of age, pre-microbrew, pre-legal, stashing 6-packs of Kokanee or extra
In the
old
bushes.
stuff in a bush, outside of Fernwood Community Center, which was, where 95% of our local metal shows happened at that time, because on the island, it was very, very rare at that time that big acts would come over, right? We'd have to go to Vancouver if we wanted to see Maiden or Metallica or anybody like that. So for that reason, for better or worse, we were kind of cut off, but it also meant that we kind of had this, this small group of bands that were kind of our bands, Armorous and Mission of Christ and Tantrum and Witch's Hammer would come over from Vancouver. And, I played in a handful back then, but, anyway, so that kind of, that warm, extra old stock taste it's directly correlated to, those insane early all ages gigs at the Fernwood Community Center.
Let's talk about your youth, your soundtrack of your youth. When you were growing up in your parents' or guardians' house, what music was playing when you were not in control? What music did they listen to?
I was pretty lucky. My parents were both pretty into music, and I know now, I didn't know at the time, they had pretty good taste for the most part. Lots of Beatles, lots of Kinks, some Bob Marley, some Santana, some, splashes of classical here and there. They were really into folk music. They were actually also really oddly into a lot of like Middle Eastern music that came out of Northern Africa. My dad, was a hobby musician, and my mom was as well. So like from day one, it was a pretty eclectic music environment in our house. But of course, when you threw Slayer Reign of Blood into that mix, it sort of changed things.
What was their reaction? My parents were always very open to my musical, whatever I brought into the house. My dad was super cool with it. What were your parents like?
Overall, much the same. Although, I think there was inevitably that sense of fear that, if I was singing along and, with Rain and Blood and screamed, "Do you want to die?" Competing with Tom Araya, it undoubtedly, had caused some alarm for some fairly, peaceful, left coast parents, and I remember my dad used to walk around the house and like wail in like a really intentionally bad way, trying to imitate Bruce Dickinson's voice. So he would kind of take the piss out of it. So, I think probably a lot of the death metal, I got into pretty early for them was maybe a little bit alarming, the obituaries and the Morbid Angels and the deaths, et cetera. But overall, given the fact that they were listening to some pretty unusual music themselves, they couldn't really be a judge. So overall, they were pretty accepting.
How about your first shows? You were mentioning those all ages shows on the island. What would have been the first music experience that you went to go see?
Oh boy. I mean, my first musical experience was actually probably like my dad jamming with some friends in the living room in our house, right? Like, there was instruments out. My dad plays a instrument called the oud, which is like a lute, which is a predecessor to the guitar, one of those big bellied acoustic instruments. So there was always a lot of music. So I guess that would be the house gig would be the very first. Honestly, I think the memorable gigs were, pre-Fernwood Community Center, there was this place in Victoria called the Rat's Nest, and anyone in Victoria on the West Coast who are of similar age will know it. It was a notorious house kind of in the semi-industrial area of Victoria. And it was a house with a basement, and that's where a lot of the early punk and metal gigs happened. Dayglow Abortions played there. I think Probably No Means No played there a few times, and a bunch of the bands I already mentioned, like Mission of Christ and probably DOA swung through there a few times and stuff like that. So I was definitely not supposed to be there because this is going pretty far back. And I remember feeling like the little kid in the basement. And so, always a little bit of those nerves, and it being super loud and super, pretty, that kind of aggressive vibe. And I was probably 15 or 16, and that was all brand new. So that's etched in my memory as really the first time being at a show that I went to because I wanted to be there.
And it was like a strange fear thing. I remember my first shows. I was there and I was terrified, but super exhilarated at the same time. And it's almost the same thing as being much younger at a video store and perusing the horror section. Just looking.
I was rolling, for whatever reason at that age, I seemed to be rolling with, guys that were 2 or 3 years older than me, which of course, if the difference between 15 and 18 is huge, right? So I was kind of like the big little kid tagging along. So I always felt like, again, I wasn't really supposed to be there, but I was rolling with these older guys, so I was going to be okay. Those are, man, I'd love to be a fly on the wall to go back to those moments. That would be super cool.
How about your first time on stage?
Oh boy. I think it was the first metal band I played in was with a guy named Jason Flower, based out of Victoria, who runs Supreme Echo Records and is doing some amazing work out there. We had a band called Dementia. I think we lasted like not even a year. Those were basement gigs, and I think we had like literally 3 or 4 songs we were playing to a group of friends. So, it's not the most glamorous starting point, but the reality is I started pretty young. Like I think I was 13, 14 when we made our first demo, and we were playing. It was all basement. It was like all basement and community center shows at that time, obviously, because we weren't of age, but that's also just where, you could play metal shows, right? That was that early world of metal for me.
Insane. Amazing. Always the bass. You always gravitated towards the bass.
Yeah. It's funny. I wanted to play the drums, I just admired the drumming, the coordination and the agility and that kind of the power of drumming. So for whatever reason, I was always drawn to, I think, the rhythm section, but, we lived in a rental and we didn't have much money. So the drums were out the door. And I remember on the 12th Christmas when I was 12, I came down, and under the Christmas tree was this beat up old Fender copy bass, which my dad actually fixed up. I don't think it was even working, with a little Christmas bow on the headstock. And that was the first instrument. But funny thing, I distinctly remember, like, this is maybe getting into the weeds a bit, but like not even being able to hear the bass in music. And my dad, like, we would listen to the Kinks or the Beatles, and my dad would be like, okay, can you hear McCartney's bass line? It's going dum, 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 around everything else. And I literally remember not being able to hear it, which is so fascinating, because I was cued into the vocals and the melody and the guitar, kind of the more obvious stuff, if you will. And then slowly over time, learned how to hear the bass. And then from there, once, goes without saying, once Steve Harris and Geddy Lee and Cliff Burton entered the equation, no turning back.
You heard the bass. Do you remember the last show you went to before COVID shut everything down?
Oh man, it was, I think it was Amon Amarth, Arch Enemy, and At the Gates.
Yeah, that was a good tour.
Down at I still call it the docks. I can't even keep track of what it's called anymore. It doesn't matter. The place. It was great. Big show. Again, another one of those shows which made me realize, holy, Amon Amarth is like, they're on this level now. But, I was really there for ATG because that's where my heart is. So, it's kind of nice to like go to gigs for this many years and then still realize you're going for the opening band.
Oh, I can't wait to go back and get those goosebumps. I know I'm just picturing it, just my first show back as a spectator and as someone performing. But
you know, the last show that I was gonna go to before the pandemic hit was Opeth, right? But Michael got laryngitis or whatever and canceled those shows. So that I think was like literally February 2020, somewhere in there. So I was super bummed. And then after COVID hit, just extra bummed because I realized that would have been the last show I would have seen. So yeah.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Banger. I mentioned earlier, it's become an empire. You know, you got movies, TVs, you got Banger Live, you got shows for kids. It's never ending. It's always expanding. When you started, I'm going to make a documentary about metal, did you ever imagine that you would be where you are at now?
No, is the short answer. You know, for Scott and I, it started with that first movie and just wanted to make a great movie about metal because we felt it hadn't been done. And, you know, we were fortunate. It was a successful film. Like our debut film was at TIFF and it got bought in dozens of countries around the world. And it really resonated with metal fans. It resonated with metal musicians too, which ended up being a really important piece because then that meant we established relationships with Rush and with Alice and with Maiden and a lot of those artists who appeared in that first movie, right? So it kind of went from there. And then, you know, eventually just made the decision that we just didn't want to go from one film to the next and expanded into series work with Metal Evolution, and then wanted to build this brand of Evolution, like top quality kind of documentary series looking at specific music genres. So then did hip hop, and then we've more recently done K-pop. So, you know, the story goes on, but the short answer is no. But I think, you know, we realized, at least starting with metal, that we'd kind of opened a door into a world that really hadn't been looked at. And a lot of those legacy artists, like I mentioned, none of them have had definitive films made about their careers. Meanwhile, you know, the Neil Youngs and the Rolling Stones and et cetera, no disrespect, but they've each had multiple films made about their career. And we're like, well, why not Maiden? And these are bands that have been around for just as long and have legions of fans around the world. So it kind of started from there. And then, you know, really just carrying the philosophy forward of just telling stories about music that firstly don't alienate the fan base, you know, don't talk down to the fans, you know, don't be pedantic to the people who know, but also trying to strike that tricky balance to telling stories that are going to appeal to a broader audience, right? And, you know, it's difficult. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't, but that's always the intention.
How did that go down the first time around? Me being someone that books my own interviews and I do everything myself, I'm interested how you got all these amazing musicians for Headbanger's journey. What was that pitch like? Did you do it on your own, or did you have people? Did you go through publicists? I imagine it was a mix of everything.
Yeah, well, you know, it took 5 years to make that movie.
Wow.
If you factor in literally from the day we were like, hey, should we make a documentary about metal? To like the TIFF premiere in 2005, right? So it was a long journey. And if we knew it was going to take that long, probably wouldn't have done it. So good thing. Naivety is sometimes, you know, a little good to have a little bit of naivety in there. But I think that we kind of hustled ourselves. Scott, my business partner, was working as a music supervisor and had worked as an AD in film. So he had some connections within the industry. And I was just finishing grad school at that time. And we just started reaching out to some key managers. And, you know, remember we typed out letters and put them in envelopes and sent them, right? To this day, you know, one of the most important people in terms of our own story is Rod Smallwood, the manager of Iron Maiden, because he was someone that believed in us early. I think something in the way we were approaching the subject of metal, he understood we were coming from a place of respect. Also, ideally wanted to do something that was going to be big and make an impact. So Rod was really instrumental. Like, he connected us with a whole range of other artists, and obviously helped us get the interview, you know, got the interview with Bruce, at Hammersmith. And it kind of went from this kind of a snowball effect. Like once you get Maiden and Slayer and a few others, it just gets easier and easier, right? Because you can tell people, well, hey, we got these folks, and it kind of goes from there. So it was messy. We didn't know what we were doing, but good thing we didn't have any kids and nothing else to do. So we could take 5 years to do it.
It's incredible. And I remember the movie, it such a huge impact on me, and that, especially that Bruce interview when he's talking about bringing that fan in the back and he's right here in your hand or on his thumb or something. It really impacted me as a front man of what I need to do on stage. So thank you. Thank you for that interview.
I mean, man, literally when I say in the film, if the 12-year-old Sam knew I was doing this, I probably would like collapse. Is totally true. So I'm just glad, like, I was 30 by the time we got to making that film. And so at least was able to, approach it more from a professional standpoint than a fan standpoint. Just because if it was just a pure fan in the room, I'd just want to like talk about Steve Harris bass lines and the lyrics to Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And, it would get pretty tedious pretty quick.
I get nervous still sometimes when I sit down before we start these things. Do you still get nervous? Was there moments with, this huge star that you loved your whole life, right before you sit down with them, do you get the butterflies?
Sometimes, less so now, but I get more nervous about, like, is this interview going to go well? And is this am I going to be, am I going to feel good about doing my job as an interviewer and a storyteller and making sure people feel comfortable in terms of opening up to me? I think that's probably most interviewers go through that. So I think less so the starstruck thing, but more always like never assume, like you can't mail it in, right?
No.
And so I think that, I still take that very seriously, like with the ZZ film, for example, like, and working with those guys, like getting to the story. So, compared to, 17 years ago, I look at it much more from the perspective of a documentary filmmaker than a fan of metal, right?
Let's talk about an interview that got away from you. There's the classic Mayhem one, of course, from Headbangers. I saw you with Abbott. He was very entertaining.
Yeah.
What else would be some interviews that you were not in control that are worth mentioning, or that you wish you could do again, basically?
Well, I mentioned the ZZ film, like getting started with Billy Gibbons, had some challenges. He's someone who takes time to get to know Billy, and I came to realize pretty quick that, Billy is similar to Alice Cooper in a sense that they kind of are their character. And the line is very vague sometimes, right? So, with Billy, we got there eventually, I felt, with that film and those interviews, but it took time. It takes time, I think, particularly, and this, like with artists who have very well-worn narratives about their career and their lives, right? And especially when you're dealing with artists who have been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the case of ZZ, like these narratives are deep, and to try and find another way in or get them away from their normal kind of press mode thing can take some work, right? So, so Billy, we got there, but it took some time.
It's all about patience, right? So that's what I've been learning, is just to wait and to listen and to be open to where this conversation is going to go.
Yeah, and be respectful of the time that it takes, right? That's why, these films and these series that we make, I mean, they're 1.5 to 3 years of our life, typically from top to bottom, right? So in terms of the whole process, so you just kind of got to honor that time. And the magic word is trust, especially when you're dealing with, when you're telling stories that are like going to be the definitive documentary about a person's life and career, like, that takes some trust building, right? And often that's just time together, right? You're not going to get the gold in hour 1. You're going to get it in hour 6 or 7.
Yeah. And they've done so many interviews. A lot of artists don't even trust people that conduct interviews. So it's really just a matter of just being there and showing them that you really want to show what's best of them.
Yeah. And yeah, so another way of looking at, that is that because when you're making documentary, we try to distance ourselves from press. Like we're not, especially remember in the early days with the metal, with Headbanger's journey and Metal Evolution, it's like, we're not there to talk about the latest record. We're not there to talk about how the tour is going. We're not there to talk about something that happened recently. It's like, no, we're going to step back here. And that just sort of sometimes the artist just, sometimes the artist just sits down and has no idea what the interview is about, right? Which is a whole that's a whole other conversation. But for a documentary filmmaker, when you've only got an hour, which to us is sort of bare minimum, it's like, sometimes it takes a lot of work to get to the place where, again, they're not just talking about how the tour is going or the recording of the new album. Yeah.
And sometimes they're on autopilot too.
There is that, but, I probably would be too if I had done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews, during my life.
We have so much going on. The Bangers just expanded beyond belief in so many different facets. Are there times that you wish that it was simpler? How do you handle all of this? And I assume that you've brought a lot more people into the team to run these things, but you and Scott are still the main focus points and have control of everything.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, goes without saying, the company's grown. We hover around 40 to 50 employees generally, depending on where we are in terms of how many shows we have in production and where we are in the cycle of things. So, certainly our roles have swung a lot more towards, thinking about the business, over time. We started more creative, and that's where we started. And over time, come to focus more on the business. So certainly that brings its challenges. You have to work with people, and loyalty is important to us. So it's important you keep the people you love and keep them motivated and all those things. But but at the end, I think what I really love about what we're doing and where we're going is that there's our scope is so broad now. We're starting to develop scripted series, and we've got the kids stuff, and we're now developing shows, documentaries or series that aren't music focused, and sports is kind of in the picture now. And so the challenges of kind of management and running a business is offset by the fact that we're able to work with all these amazing people and different directors who come to us and want to make a show. And so it's like, we've got so many fascinating things we're developing that, I just sound like a bitch if I complained. Let's just put it that way.
Amazing. Let's talk about VH1, the music evolution that you guys did, Metal Evolution. Why it subsequently got released, but why was the extreme metal one excluded from the original package?
After we did the original 11, we did go back to VH1 with a proposal for, I think it was like 4 or 5 additional episodes. Like, we didn't think at that time, I mean, now there's a whole other season that could be made, which is a separate conversation. But at that time, sort of on the heels of, that was 2011 when the series came out. We had like 4 or 5 that we thought, hey, if we're going to do, we think there's like a follow-up half season to be done here. And, VH1, they were basically like, you know what, we're good. This show is doing well for us. 11 hours, we got what we wanted. And so we sort of went away and said, well, among the ideas we were presenting for the second season, extreme metal just seemed like the one that had to be made somehow. And personally, because that's sort of where, the bulk of my metal listening is, and so, we found a different way to do it through crowdfunding and doing it as a digital release. So, I would have loved that it could have had that, that obviously that bigger platform of VH1. But in the end, I mean, it's still the most watched thing we've ever done through Banger TV, right? So yeah, glad we got it done. Although there's probably 2 or 3 sequels that could be done now, because man, this music's changing and moving so fast.
All the time.
Yeah,
All the time.
yeah.
Let's talk about how you've been filling the void of live music experiences. Obviously, you've been very busy with the production and the running of everything, but how have you been filling that void of not getting bombarded by live music experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've been driving a lot, spending time up north. And so I spend a lot of time in the car listening to music and finding that right album for that right moment. And I don't know what it is, but Enslaved does very well for me in the northern areas of Ontario. You know, there's just certain bands that just seem to fit certain contexts. So I guess that would be it. You know, I play, unfortunately, just don't have the time to play much music these days with Banger and being a dad and a husband. But you know, the bass is always out at home, and I'm always noodling around when I get that itch. You know, but yeah,
set up with the amp and everything.
Not always, not enough is the better answer. Not enough. I don't have the Ampeg 6x10 fired up nearly as much as I should, to be honest with you. But yeah, so it's probably a combination of like, yeah, the closest I get is like being on the open road with the window down and just, you know, with, you know, Enslaved or someone else blaring, you know. Yeah.
Amazing. Back in 2017, Henderson did the Banger Brews. It was a monthly metal night. Jamie Morris curated the playlist for that, and you guys made 4 brews. So talk to me about that, and then I want to hear about if you could make new brews, what would you do?
Well, it was actually 1 brew just with 4 different labels.
Okay.
So it was just sort of a limited edition. So yeah, we partnered with Henderson. You know, they do a lot of amazing partnerships, and we're in the same building, and they love metal, we love beer, so it just seemed obvious. And we put together the beer with them, which was we were going with kind of like a lagered ale approach. You know, it was summertime, so we actually wanted something that was going to be easy to drink and accessible. And you know, at that time, I'm gapping on the brew, the one that's right out in the far east of Ontario in Van Cleek. What's the name in the tall?
Bose.
Bose was kind of like in the Bose world. That's the Bose lug tread. That was kind of the world you wanted to be in. And so refreshing, but kind of, you know, disappears quickly, no hoppiness, all that kind of stuff. So it was fun. It was super fun. We got to do the labels and actually be involved. And I'm sure you've talked about this many times on your show, but I really gained a respect for it truly is an art and a science, right? Brewing. And I knew nothing about brewing and still don't know anything, but got a bit of a crash course from the brewmaster at Henderson's and really gained a respect for the process and the time and the sampling and all of that. You know, it was fun. It's fun to be a part of. Yeah, the sampling is the obvious part.
Is always the best part, but
yeah, but it just goes to show, like it's like anything. Like you're never going to nail it on the first try. You've got to. It takes work, right? It's like it takes work to get there. So, yeah, it's a fun process. Hope to do it again one day.
If you could do it again, what style of beer would you go for, and what would you call it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my heart is in the kind of British malty, you know, less carbonated kind of world. You know, I grew up or I was born rather in an area of England where, you know, real ale, cask ale is taken very seriously. So I guess it's in the blood somewhere. So that's probably where I would go. What I would call it, that's going to take some work. That's big pressure to come up with a name, but
Banger Brew is a great name. I really like that.
Yeah. But I think, you know, stylistically, that's probably where I would go, because that's my home place, right? In terms of beer.
Amazing. We have met once before. You probably don't remember this, but I most certainly do. We were coming out of a pizza in Toronto. I was in 3 Mile Stream at the time. And as we were stepping out of the pizza, you were standing right there. My bassist, Mike Marino, was like, "That's Sam Dunn." And he went up and spoke to you. And he was like, "We're playing with Cryptopsy," because I was in a Cryptopsy at the time. And he's like, "Right there." And you were like, "Oh shit, I'm coming." And you came to the show.
Fuck, man. I feel like such a jerk. I don't remember that.
No, I totally didn't expect you to. But
that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Certainly, pizza and going to a metal show is deeply familiar. And I don't know where. I'm guessing that was probably down on Queen Street. Was that
exactly? Yeah.
I remember the show. That was oh man, what was the place called? It was upstairs.
Exactly. The Zoo or the
yeah.
Is that it? Am I crazy? Or it became the Zoo? There's a lot of switching names.
A block over from the Bovine.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it was like the pizza, and it was right there at the gig.
I do remember the gig. I do remember the gig and the pizza.
That was the gig when I was like, I'm going to say yes to Flow, and I'm going to join Cryptopsy.
No way.
That's true. Yeah.
Super cool.
Totally true. Let's wrap this up with one last question. It probably doesn't happen to you very often because you're extremely busy doing 10,000 million things, releasing so many amazing things, but every once in a while, it happens to everyone. What is your hangover cure?
My hangover cure. A handful of Advil, really strong coffee, and maybe a bit of fresh air. Sorry, that's not very exciting. I'm a bit of a hippie at heart. I should say I'm chase it with a beer the next morning, but yeah, no. Coffee and some air. It's probably the best place to be.
Fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me. I truly, truly appreciate it. Huge fan of what you're doing. Keep going, keep growing, keep releasing amazing things about music and metal, and maybe you could do something about craft beer one day.
Let's do it. I'm game. Always in.
Cheers.
Thanks, Matt. Cheers.
Hey, thank you all so much for listening right to the end. You know that I love and appreciate that. Man, was I ever stoked to have a chat with Sam Dunn. When I started this podcast, he was one of the original people I wanted to speak with. Metal, A Headbanger's Journey was such an important movie in my metal upbringing. I'm just so damn stoked that Sam took the time to have a chat with me. Can't wait to hook up with Sam again and to share a brew in the flesh next time. I'm really looking forward to that. If you enjoyed this Vox and Hops episode, you should sign up to the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast's mailing list. You could do that on my website, voxandhops.com. That's VOXANDHOPS.com. And when you do that, you shall receive one email a week containing all of the details of everything that has happened throughout the past week in the world of the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast. There is a lot of things going on in the world of the Vox and Hops Metal Podcast, so I would hate for you to miss a single thing. So please do me a favor and sign up to the mailing list. The Vox and Hops Metal Podcast is brought to you by Sound Talent Media. I have one more episode coming up this Friday, but until then, remember to enjoy life, metal, and craft beer. Cheers, Vox and Hops hits.